One of my all-time favourite things about whiskey is sharing it, so why not do it properly? Welcome back, Dram fam, to the Whisky Diary. Many of my friends love their whiskey, but I think they'd probably argue that I've ventured a little further down the rabbit hole than they have. Because of that, whenever I venture back down south to see them and we are having an evening in, I like to host a bit of a whiskey tasting. Not only that, but I've been to a fair few of them now, and some have certainly been better than others. A good whiskey tasting can be such a valuable and fulfilling experience, so without further ado, here is my complete guide to hosting a whiskey tasting. So, first things first, know what bottles you are going to pick for your style of tasting. I broadly break these down into three categories. It's either a themed tasting, an exploration tasting, or a blind tasting. For themed tastings, every bottle should have something that connects them. It could be only peated whiskies, it could be a regional thing, say a Campbelltown themed tasting, or it could even be as specific as bottles from a single distillery. But the main goal here is to showcase a particular attribute or segment of the whiskey market, and then help navigate your tasters around whatever theme or subject you have chosen. These sorts of tastings would be great for maybe groups that have a slightly more than basic grasp of the whiskey landscape and want to explore a particular subject a little more in depth. Potentially also great for groups that meet fairly regularly and you can kind of have a different subject every time. They may even be good for events with some kind of contextual relevance. Like say you're on a weekend up to the Highlands, you could showcase maybe some of the local distilleries. Now, for an exploration tasting, anything goes, but I'd recommend a selection covering as many bases as possible, but making sure that you tailor your picks to your taster's level of experience. These sorts of tastings are fantastic for groups with maybe a little less experience, or those that have a grasp of the basics and are looking for a way to break out of the supermarket stuff. Alternatively, if you have some pretty wild stuff at your disposal, you can get as crazy as you like with it. Maybe you are in a group that meets fairly regularly and you all take turns at showing off some of your weirder and wilder bottles. But then maybe that's a theme in and of itself. And lastly, a blind tasting is just that, blind. Only you know what the drams are, and it's your job to guide the tasters through their tasting with as much or as little help as you like. Even for the most experienced whiskey drinker, a blind tasting can completely throw you for a loop. It's incredibly surprising how much you can learn about your own palate when you have no idea what's in the glass. Regardless of what style of tasting you go for, I'd recommend no less than 4 bottles and maybe no more than 7. Personally, I find 5 or 6 tends to be the sweet spot depending on the time that you've got and the experience of your group. But remember, whilst you might be used to tanning a load of 55% cask strength liquid on the regular, the inexperienced can sometimes find even 40% can be quite a chore to work through. So you now know which bottles you're taking, but what order you drink them in can make a massive difference. But before you even get to drinking, there's a few things you need. The table should be set with a place for each taster, and in each place there should be a glass for whiskey and a glass for water. That is assuming that you don't have a clean glass for every dram for every person sitting at the table. Now make sure there is a jug with plenty of water so their glass can be rinsed out in between drams, and if you can, keep an extra few glasses to hand so that if anyone wants to park their current whiskey to drink later, they can. I'd also recommend printing like a details sheet for all of the whiskies. This should contain at least the whiskey name, the distillery, the region, the age, and the ABV. For lesser experienced tasters, it might even be worth noting down some of like the tasting notes for just nose, palate, and finish. Nothing super in-depth or detailed, but just something to help them feel less intimidated when it comes to talking about the drams. Now, when it comes to actually ordering the whiskies, the easiest way to approach this is to put the mildest ones first and the biggest, kind of most challenging drams at the end. And if there is any peat in there, that is best saved for last. As I said previously, for the less regular whiskey drinkers, the ABV alone can be quite difficult to get past. So starting with something that's really light and easygoing helps to get the palate warmed up a bit, and you can see how everyone gets on with that. If anyone seems to be struggling with the ABV, you can always suggest, they add a little drop of water or something like that. As for measures, I'd recommend starting with about 10 to 15 ml pours. You may or may not know the group that you're hosting, but generally over the course of a tasting, with enough water in between, most people can tolerate about 50 ml of 40 something % liquid fairly well. If you know them well, then obviously do whatever you're comfortable with, but if you're hosting an unknown group, I think that 50 ml is a fairly decent place to start. Now, a side note. I've been to a fair few tastings in my time, and I know this is probably not relevant for the more experienced drinkers, but it's not uncommon at these sorts of things for a bit of bravado to make an appearance. Some of the group might not want to be seen kind of diluting it, or might see it as a bit of a cop-out, not downing it. Obviously, there is only so much you can do, but leading by example is often a surefire way to get past it pretty quickly. Share anecdotes of how even you struggle with it sometimes, and how often you add water to whiskey, and then show them how to do it. Before you know it, like, the whole group will be following along, as they won't want to feel left out. And remember, like, you're the host, they will always be looking to you for guidance. And now it's time for a dram. Introduce the bottle, or the dram number if it's a blind tasting, and start talking about it as you pour the measures. Right here is where so many people make the biggest mistake at any whiskey tasting. Just let them drink it. You've probably got a full table of people here that are pretty excited to try some whiskey, and there is nothing worse than being sat there with a full glass in front of you and feeling like it would be rude to take a swig. When it's the other way round, I'm sorry, but honestly, I'm probably not listening to you. I'm sat there thinking, will you shut up and let me drink it? Obviously, I am interested in what you've got to say, but I also really want to drink it. So my advice to you is, when the glass is full, let them go in for a swig. Now everyone's enjoying the liquid, look around, make sure that everyone is okay with the ABV, and if anyone needs it, just kind of nudge them towards the water, and then you can start guiding them through the key tasting phases that, of course, firstly the nose, then the palate, and finally the finish. My personal take is that I generally find it a bit more engaging to kind of mix the tasting notes along with contextually relevant information, such as talking about, the nice honey notes on the nose and how they're typical of the sweeter Speyside whiskies. Or, for more advanced tastings, you can kind of talk about how Tokai casks bring that funky fermented note. And of course, always invite others to chime in with their notes and kind of ignite the conversation, especially if you're not getting the same as they are. That is a great opportunity to kind of raise that whole everyone's palate is different and no two people have the same experience point. Once everyone's kind of said their piece and shared their notes, go around the table. Who liked it? Who didn't like it? Did they find it difficult to drink, or did it go down like water? That's going to give you some fairly good feedback as to whether anyone can actually handle the ABV properly and whether they do need to kind of focus more on the water side of things. It's at this point as well that anyone that wasn't inclined to finish their dram can park it and then ask everyone, to rinse out their glasses with a bit of water and prepare for the next dram. Rinse and repeat this for your remaining drams. The key here is pacing. I usually keep some form of timer running somewhere, and I'm usually aiming for about 10 to 15 minutes per dram. Firstly, it stops you ripping through a shed load of whiskey and ending up just a wee bit too pished. But it also ensures that anyone that might be sitting there and, not vibing that particular whiskey isn't left sitting there for 25 minutes while the rest of you discuss how utterly wonderful it was. There is plenty of time for that after the tasting. So, with the last dram drunk, one of my favourite parts of a good tasting is the show of hands at the end. Go through each dram one by one and ask for a show of hands on which was their favourite of the bunch. This part always amazes me and really does kind of drive home how varied all of our palates are. Of course, if you're hosting a blind tasting, this is where you would reveal the identity of each bottle. My personal preference here is right after the show of hands for each bottle. That's when you make the reveal. It's always kind of fun to see that shock or realization of what it is that you just voted for. Now, it does depend on the situation and it may or may not be appropriate, but on my own tastings, this is the point where I kind of like to offer a dram to each person of their favourite for the night. That keeps the conversation going. Genuinely, some of my favourite tastings that I've ever been on have been the more social ones. At the end of the day, interaction with each other is what can turn a good tasting great. But anyway, that's enough from me. Thank you all very much for watching, and of course a massive thank you to all of my patrons over on Patreon. If you've liked this video, please do click the like button, and if you'd like to support the channel, please do consider subscribing. Let me know down in the comments if you've got any kind of top tips for how to make the most of a whiskey tasting. And on that note, Slàinte mhath.